All right. Welcome, everyone. This is definitely a first of this kind, and it'll be a fun experiment to see if this format works for the future. But we thought it would be a neat way to learn and also share with Jim about the potential intersection between science and music without asking him to stand up and give a presentation, which is not necessarily in his professional portfolio as much as it is for scientists. So it's really a great honor to have Jim here as part of our Artists in Residence series. He's here for the whole week, as you know, and he's pretty new to science and is soaking up a lot of stuff, which is great, and I think it's a great opportunity for us to soak up and learn from him as well. So I'm just going to have conversation here with Jim with some questions I'm curious about, and we'll see how we get through it. And then if we have time, we'll open it up to all of you to ask some questions as well. And in the spirit of transparency and full disclosure, I worked with Will on these questions. So Jim, be prepared for questions about your high school evenings out with Will. But yeah, I should mention that Will and Jim are old friends, and it was because of Will's connection that we were able to connect with Jim and get this all orchestrated to happen. Yeah, so
nice. I caught that.
I'll slip a few of those in there for you. So anyway, thank you, Will, for helping make this all happen. So Jim, I just wanted to start off since most of us, if not all of us, are pretty naive to what it is to be in your profession and kind of how you bring your ideas to fruition through music. So some of this may feel very basic to you, but for us it'll be really insightful.
No such thing. No, it's good.
So just to start at the very beginning, like, why did you get into music as a profession, and what drew you to be a composer? I know that those are two parts of your story.
Yeah, those are two different times in my life. How did I get into music? It's my brother's fault. My older brother, left his trumpet sitting on the couch. I was 9 years old, and this was in the 70s, so it was an orange couch, and there was this trumpet sitting there, and I picked it up, and for whatever reason, I happened to get a note on my first try, and he was like, "Hey," my name was Jimmy at that point. I was not Jim. He's like, "Jimmy, let me show you a few things." So he showed me. I'm doing this because this is how we play trumpet. He knows. And he showed me how to play a scale, and I was hooked from that moment on, and I started getting some lessons, and immediately went to a summer camp called Interlochen, which is where we met at the school. At 10 years old, I attended a 8-week-long summer camp where literally your parents drop you off, you live in a cabin with 15 other kids your age, and you play concerts every weekend. And so for a 10-year-old, this was pretty amazing, to say the least. I had never done anything like that, obviously. And I did not know that classical music could be so fun. I had no idea. I thought only rock music was fun, and that's what all my friends listened to. So I sat in this orchestra at age 10, and I was hooked. And so I went to Interlochen, that summer camp, for 7 summers because I couldn't get enough of it, and I went to high school there because I couldn't get enough of it, and it was just to this day, it was just something I was extremely passionate about and always curious about, and just trying to get as good as I could at it. And so that was my initial introduction to music, was all about playing the trumpet, this very small part of a bigger thing. And thought that would be my entire career. But when I joined an orchestra at the age of 21, I started doing these other things, other projects that had to do with, first of all, arranging music, which means you take a piece of, like, let's say you heard a Taylor Swift song on the radio. I don't know why I just said Taylor Swift, but somebody mentioned it earlier today. Yeah. So let's say I have daughters who have maybe listened to it on occasion. If you hear a Taylor Swift song on the radio and you want your orchestra to play it, you will hire an arranger to take that song and make it playable by violins and trumpets and percussion and all these sort of things. So that's how I got started. For some reason, I said to a conductor, "I'd be happy to do that for you." Taylor Swift wasn't alive at that point, but it was somebody else. And so I started as an arranger. And then after doing that for 5 years or so, I thought to myself, wouldn't it be interesting if I try to write my own notes instead of arranging somebody else's? So I started composing my own. And the long story getting too long was that got so interesting that trumpet, that small part of being in music of trumpet got less interesting, and being somebody who could create the music for other trumpeters and violinists to play uh, became my passion. So,
Well, since I'm guessing none of us have composed, maybe you can give us some like insight into the process of composing, at least how you do it anyway.
can I tell a little story?
Sure.
All right. So the real reason I got into composing was or instead of arranging, was because I attended a class at Northwestern University in the summer of I was about 25. And the class was called Adventures in Bad Music. And the reason it was called that was because we just talked about, it was a group of about maybe this many people, and we talked about bad music. And that might have been Taylor Swift or something. I don't know. We just talked about, I don't mean that. But we each had to raise our hand and say, they would say, name a bad piece of music. And we each would say something, and then the instructor would make a very valid point saying, yeah, but that music you just mentioned might have sold 5 million copies in the last year. So who are you to say that that's a bad piece of music? And it just got us thinking in a reverse way about music in general. I wasn't a composer at that point, but the final assignment of that class was to write a bad piece of music. Which, because I was not a composer, I was like, I got this. This will be no problem. And so I wrote a piece, a trumpet duet, of course. Maybe we should play it someday. It was a trumpet duet, and I tried to make it as bad as I possibly could. And somebody raised their hand, I kid you not, at the end, somebody raised their hand and said, Jim, that was actually a really cool piece of music. And that's why I'm a composer to this day, because I tried to write a bad piece of music and it ended up being good. So to answer your question, I don't give myself any, I don't sit down and say, this has to be the best piece of music ever. This has to change the world. I just write music, bad music, good music, whatever, and then let the process take care of itself. So the ideas are either in my head and I'll go to a piano and get them out, or sing them into my phone so I'll remember them, or go rush to my computer where I can put it on a screen and have it played back. But I just don't ever give myself any rules or judgment when I start to compose. I just write and kind of let the piece take me wherever it'll go.
So, some of you play trumpet and maybe a few other instruments. Like, is it hard to compose for instruments you've never played, only heard, or like, what's the kind of interaction between being a musician and the instruments you know intimately versus being a composer and writing for instruments you don't know as much about?
Right. Yeah, it's a great question. I get, going back to what I just said, I kind of just give myself freedom to make mistakes. But to be a little more specific, sitting in an orchestra since the age of 10 to the age I am now, or was before I quit, was such, I didn't know it at the time, but it was such a valuable experience for being a composer. Because not only did I hear all of the instruments in such close proximity, but I also sensed what they didn't or did enjoy playing. So there were times where I'd look over and see a colleague bored out of their minds, or really sitting up and enjoying what they're doing. And so by the time I was a composer, I was really taking note of that. And so now when I compose, I literally have images in my head of these people either sitting up and enjoying it or not. And I also think about my audience too, because when you're on stage, even though they're not talking, you do get a sense of whether your audience is enjoying it or not. Like right now, they're all bored out of their minds. I can tell. No, but so my goal as a composer is to not have them get bored. So it's always in here.
Well, so that's really interesting because, when you think about public speaking, you know the audience you're going to, and you can kind of tailor your approach or message even if you're speaking to a elementary school classroom or a bunch of scientists or the general public or whatever. Like you know ahead of time to some degree who your audience is. But when you compose a piece, it's then done, and you have no idea who your audience will be. So how do you do that?
Oh, man. Well, I guess my audience is, let's say it's a concert hall of 1,500 people. I imagine 1,500 Jim Stephensons in the audience. And so I try to write music that I would be really happy listening to and experiencing, because there's no way I can predict what they're all going to enjoy. So if it passes my eye and ear test, then I just hope that it'll pass theirs as well, or move them or change them or something.
But you've written some pieces deliberately for kids too. So is that like you do have some times when you are thinking of particular audiences, and I'm guessing that influences a fair bit on how you approach composing those pieces?
Yeah. Oh, totally. I mean, specifically, we had a piece 2 days ago that was played here in at the Music Academy of the West for kids, and that was a piece I wrote in 2002, and it was specifically for kids, as you said. So I knew in that case I needed the music to be. It was a challenge because I wanted it to be intellectually rewarding for the musicians playing it, but on a level where kids would. I didn't want to dumb it down because kids are smarter than we think, but I wanted it to sound enticing and in a way that they would be energized by it. So I did very specific things in that piece, for example, like it's only 30 seconds featuring a violin, and then it goes to the other side of the stage and for 30 seconds features a tuba, and then the music is slow and immediately followed by fast music. So this is all me thinking about the attention span of children and maybe some adults. But it was all very specific in the way I composed it.
Yeah. Okay, I want to gently start to shift into questions to kind of explore the intersection of kind of our approach to science and what you do. So as you know, we have, or as you're learning, we do synthesis in particular, and through a lot of collaborative work, achieve what we're trying to do in terms of scientific discovery. So this is, I guess, maybe a complex question, but as we've heard, you're an arranger and a performer and a composer. I've heard you also done some conducting. So you've got these different modes of engaging with the craft of music. And I'm wondering if you can speak either all of those roles or individually how collaboration or even synthesis, if you feel that that's part of the experience, fits into these roles and how.
Well, there's one very specific way where it doesn't, and I've already spoken in our interviews about this, and I'm sort of curious to see if it could, because composing is it's a very singular event. We sit in our room, and I think in most of our cases we don't want to share our music until it's complete. We don't want any input because it's ours, and there's actually kind of it's a negative part of our business. If your music sounds like anybody else, you're immediately kind of written off, like, oh, you don't have any original ideas, so next, right. That kind of thing. So that's from what I'm taking in, that seems to be very different. And I'm sort of curious what would happen if composers did get in a room and in the middle of our craft and got input. And in the old days, we had editors. We would write our music and the editor would look at it and say, that's terrible, fix that. But we don't have that anymore because of the self-publishing phenomenon that's taken over because of technology and what we can do. So a lot of music just gets put out there without anybody else looking at it, and that's just the way it's gone. However, back to that, I am still curious if composers could and would be willing to sit in a room, what would happen? I'll probably look into that. Cool. The other part is, I'm not sure if this is answering your question, but because I was a performer, because I conduct, because I'm a composer, everything I write, I am thinking about the experience of the other people, as I sort of hinted at, especially now that I'm a conductor. Conductors have to look at musical scores, obviously, and this is created by the composer. So I'm very much thinking, now that I conduct, about what I write so that I make the job very much easier for the conductor. Even it comes down to like when they have to turn the page and where they have to look on the score. It's changed the way I compose quite a bit. So that, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Maybe you can maybe this is too soon, too hard, but like, this idea of synthesis, and we spoke a little bit about this, but do you think that there's a mode of synthesis that happens in either performance as a musician or composition as a composer?
Um, who was I? Was it Julie? Were we talking about the musicians on stage, right? So I'm going to steal her answer, or what she. And you can help me out if this is what you're asking. But when you have a symphony orchestra, for example, or a jazz band, as you suggested too, you have all these different instruments and highly trained individuals who have mastered their craft in each instrument. So you have great violinists, you have amazing trumpet players, percussion, cellists, flute, everything. All these people playing instruments that sound different, that look different. Even the people playing them, of course, look different, sound different. Yet we all have to come together and work together to create this thing. So sometimes one of us is in the spotlight, and everybody else supports that, but then that person backs off and somebody else gets the spotlight. Other times everybody's playing together at once with harmonies and rhythms and all these things that have to blend together, be in tune, it always amazes. This is not, I'm getting off on a tangent, but I mean, imagine 100 people on stage and the conductor goes, bam, and everybody has to take a breath or do this. Whatever our individual bodies have to do to create a sound at the exact same time. The most beautiful sound, perfectly together. There's this amazing thing happening, which I don't know if that can be quantified or, with data. But something happens where we all go, and the sound happens. So is that synthesis? I don't know. It's just all these different instruments creating this thing together.
Yeah, I mean, one of the ways that we think about synthesis in science is that you have bits of information that are separated or disparate to begin with, and you're trying to pull them together and discover new insight out of that.
Yeah.
So maybe, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I could see the idea, maybe this is pressing an analogy too far, but that the individual instruments are those pieces, and when you put them together, you get something that's greater than the individual parts. Right?
But not only that, but because it's happening in real time, one player might say, well, this is what I think of this melody. And then the other person responds to that. And music, that's why music is never the same thing twice. Because people are like, oh, that was cool. Maybe that should be a little louder. I'll do that. Well, that phrase got sadder or got slower or something. And then this magical thing happens where we don't say a word, but there's this nonverbal communication going on.
That's great. So not
Can
as
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
So then, because I'm a composer now, so then it's my job as a composer to create those avenues for the players to do that. And that's what actually I'm really passionate about, getting more and more passionate about.
Well, so what does one of those avenues look like? How do you create the space for them to do that?
By creating hopefully interesting musical material so that human beings feel compelled to put their own personality into it. I could write very, I don't want to say the wrong words, but I'm going to, mathematical music or just music that doesn't have any human emotion to it. And then you can sense it when the musicians are just like, yeah, whatever. I just playing mathematical rhythms, and next I want to play some Brahms or Beethoven because those composers figured out a way to write stuff that speaks to our hearts. And so I want to write that kind of music.
Well, so I'm going to stretch my memory on music history, but so you have the classics like Mozart that sound maybe a bit more like this mathematical approach, and then the Romantics shifted out of it, or no?
No, the music could be what's the word I'm looking for? I'm a musician, I should know this word. I mean, you can study the music and apply theory to it that is somewhat mathematically based, and you can say, oh, that chord goes to this chord, which then goes to this chord. It all follows a pattern, but within that, Mozart created space for musicians to really play beautiful melodies and express their emotions. I'm talking, if I might be blunt, I'm talking more about music that's gotten, the 20th century had some rough spots in music. because it got strictly mathematical and random sounding. It's hard to say that because mathematics and random don't really go together, but it sounds random, even though there might be some sort of code they use to put it together. And then some composer said, I'm going to write music that there's no pattern whatsoever. And they're just experimenting with sounds, which is fine. I mean, it's all part of a process. But we did lose some audience in the 20th century because humans just couldn't relate to it.
So you've already said as a composer you don't yet collaborate, but as a musician obviously you do, and it sounds like as a conductor you're collaborating in a way. So I'm wondering, like, what qualities do you see as important in the art and craft of music to collaborate? Like, when you're at your best, what are you bringing to the collaboration? Like, what skills or attributes or
that's hard. It's when the unpredictable moment happens, where everybody's bringing their best to the table. Everybody has practiced their individual parts, so that, as you already said, so that we get to this greater thing. That's when the collaboration just feels the best, when everybody is all in. Because audiences probably don't sense it, but if we're on stage together, we can tell when somebody hasn't maybe brought their A game that day or didn't study or something like that. But I'm just speaking from personal experience. I just try to always get myself prepared to a level that if somebody throws me a curveball per se, I can handle it because I'm prepared. And so if you get the sense that everybody does that, that's when collaboration's at its best, I think.
So Will pointed me to this part on your website where you say that musicians love to interact with one another and to raise a question to a colleague and have them answer it, which is a really, for me, fascinating way of presenting kind of what musicians do. I wouldn't have thought of it as like raising a question and see what their answer is. So maybe you can explain that a little bit more. Like, for science, that's fundamentally what we do, like in a lot of ways. So like in this kind of musical setting, what does that mean? What does that look like?
Just to try to take it to another level, to do something that's never been done before, to provoke, so I used to play in a brass quintet, which is 2 trumpets, a French horn, a trombone, and a tuba. And so it's 5 people doing a lot of concerts together. And I had this special relationship with the other trumpet player who sat across from me. And without even, like I said, it was unspoken, but we could just do something while we're playing. And the other person would respond. And we'd try to do it to somebody else in the group and they wouldn't get it, but we just had this thing where we just, kind of do that. And the music making would just get better and better and better and better. So that's, I don't know. That's my passion, is to it's this human experience, right? I mean, we're all maybe here once, I think, right? What does everybody in this room think? You probably have a different, I don't know. So just to try to make the moments that we're all existing in at that time meaningful.
I mean, it seems like jazz is like that epitomized, but I wouldn't have thought of like composed orchestral music as that.
Because it's all written down.
Yeah. So is it, and there must be a size aspect to it as well. Like a quintet, I could see it being a little bit easier, but if you have an orchestra of 100 people, how does that look in that setting?
Yeah, it's hard because you have one person in charge, the conductor, and then you have individual people who are sort of more in charge, and that would be your first violinist and your first trumpet player and your oboe player and first percussionist. Everybody else has to follow them, and they're following the conductor, so there is this sort of hierarchy. But like I said, it's the moments that the notes that are on a page, these are just a guideline. Yes, we have to play that. And I was saying this in a master class I gave the other day with students at the Music Academy. We composers actually want you to do more than what is on the page. And I don't know how to really say that other than, if I wrote for you to get louder and then get softer. There's so many different levels of loud and soft that you can do. There isn't an exact loud. It depends who you're. Somebody may be able to play louder than this other person, so you have to tailor your loud to what that person can do, and vice versa. And with softs, so you have to kind of feel the moment and then go with this, and like I said, just create something that is personal and special and hopefully never done before. We composers are just giving you a guideline for you to express your personality.
So when maybe particularly in this quintet example with your personal story, like, did you ever pose one of these musical questions and have the other person say, "That's a stupid idea"?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because we do that all the time in science.
Really?
Oh yeah. That's our craft, is telling people
how dumb that
well,
idea
we
was.
try to phrase it differently, but
Oh, that happens all the time. Yeah.
what does that look like? They just move on in a completely different direction. You realize.
Well, then they respond with how they feel about it,
I see.
and then you have a chance. It might be 10 minutes later in the piece, but then you have a chance to either agree with what they said or say, "No, this is what I think." And then they say, "No, this is what I think." And then the piece is over, people clap, and you go off stage and get a beer. Did I just say that? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, maybe I want to dig a little deeper in that. Like, do you feel like that's actually an important part of the creative process? Is that kind of disagreement of these questions posed, or?
Yeah, I mean, well, we're forgetting one part of it, and that's the rehearsal process. So a lot of those disagreements might happen in the rehearsal,
right,
before the concert, and so maybe those are the experiments. I don't know, but and there are times where it actually gets quite contentious, and you literally fight about how you think about 4 notes, which is kind of bizarre to think about, but it does happen.
Yeah. Okay. I want to dig a little deeper on this idea of synthesis. We touched on it a little bit more, but like, so one way we thought about it is sort of individual instruments coming together to create a whole that's greater than the sum of the parts. But when you're composing music, like, obviously that's a key part of what you're thinking of in synthesis, but are there other elements you're trying to think about in terms of which instruments might create a different kind of synthesis, which notes might inspire this kind of synthetic creative process in a different way, or do you not even think about it and it's just an emergent property?
The way I think, well, you just sort of prompted my answer. I am often trying to pair instruments that may not have been paired before, or even going a step further, if I may continue to talk about trumpet, I may decide, well, this was a piece, I keep looking over here because Will was there the other day, but I had a piece for trumpet and vibraphone, and I wanted the trumpet and the vibraphone to sound very similar to one another, which you wouldn't normally think of, right? A vibraphone is this sort of mallet instrument that has a ring to it, and a trumpet is this loud, annoying sometimes instrument that does not sound like a percussion instrument. So I put a special mute into the trumpet, what's called a cut mute, and by doing that it softens the sound and makes it actually sound more like a vibraphone. So this is a way of is that creating synthesis? Anybody? I don't know. Just trying to get 2 instruments that wouldn't normally work together to do that. And I think it did kind of work. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think we aspire for that in what we call interdisciplinary science, right? Where you're bringing 2 disciplines that don't necessarily work together before to address a question in a new way and see what comes out of that. So
that's exactly what I was going to say. It was all interdisciplinary science.
Yeah. Quick learner. So you've already commented on kind of the influence and role of your early years as a trumpet player and being a musician, but like from what Will has told me, like you stay connected to the trumpet, you keep playing it at least some, so that you don't kind of lose that understanding of what it's like to play an instrument. And I'm wondering if there's anything if there's an analogy or a lesson learned there for scientists that you could imagine, like, I don't know whether it's returning to coursework or keeping our analytical skills honed in order to answer the right questions, or maybe I'm putting too many words in your mouth.
Well, as again, weren't we talking about this? We talked about your previous work. I'm looking at Julie with squid. What's the plural of squid? Squid. Okay. Squids. And now you're doing different work, which maybe you would like to go back and apply to your earlier work. Is that true? I mean, because you've learned all the data and coding process, and she had to learn that on the job back then, and now she's doing more of it. So, there's that. The better I get at composing, I don't play trumpet very well anymore, but it would be interesting for me now that I'm a composer to see what kind of trumpet music I would write if I were still performing as much, because I would probably have to play my own music, but now I don't play anymore, so there's a little bit of a difference. But I do try to stay attached to it a little bit, just so I don't forget what it's like to be a performer. It's very easy for composers to forget what it's like to actually be the one on stage who has to stand in front of 1,000 people with the spotlight on them. So I try to stay connected to that, because we can't do our work without performers. We're nothing without them. So, yeah, I'm not really answering your question.
No, that's fine. I'm curious, like, if I'm guessing you have had an experience where you've composed a piece that was performed and it just got like terrible reviews.
Don't talk about those.
We all have many failed science projects under our belt as well. So I'm curious what that feels like and what you take away from that. Does it like?
For me, it's not so much the reviews. They do affect me, but I also recognize that reviewers are people just doing a job, and they have a different set of people that they have to impress, and deadlines and all that sort of thing. I don't worry so much about them as I do about the people in the audience who are sitting around me, and most especially the performers. That I've definitely had experiences where I feel like something went flat with the people playing my music, and most important thing for me then is just to kind of go back and say why did that fail, and then try to learn from that. And audience, you can sense when people start shuffling in their seats and start looking at their program, and maybe opening a piece of candy, which is very loud in a concert hall. That means they're not engaged with what's going on. And so, I mean, look, you can't write music that is going to satisfy everybody all the time, but I think, why is that section not grabbing people? And I process it, and it'll come out later in a piece. But it's mainly the performers on stage. Because I was one,
yeah,
and I really want them to enjoy the experience, because they're pros. I don't want to, they're the ones doing the hard stuff.
Yeah.
So,
this is maybe an unfair question, but I'm curious what your understanding of the scientific process is, because I have some follow-up questions to that.
Next to zero. I think I learned about it in school once. Yeah, I need some help with that one. It seems rigorous. It seems like it takes a lot of patience. You just mentioned the failure part, which maybe I wasn't so much aware of. I feel intimidated by it, and by everybody in this room, to be honest. I'm amazed at what you guys do, or what I've learned so far about what you do. But I would love to hear more about it, if you're willing to tell me now, or ask me questions that might hint at.
Yeah, that's putting me on the spot.
Yeah, right? I think it's your turn. No, I'm fast. Composing is so. I'm just curious about everything, so I'm wanting to learn as much as I can, so that it will inform the piece of music I'm going to write. So if you want to tell me more.
Well, I mean, people have different answers to it, but for me, I think, like, from the creative side anyway of science, like, you have to kind of learn what has been done already so that you're not just reinventing the wheel that's already been done. And that also helps you then figure out where the important and interesting questions are. So there's a skill to that, and there's also, I think, an art to that of like learning how to find those key things. And then you have to either bring in the right people in the team or bring the right skills and techniques to bear, and the design, the analysis, and the experiment, and bring all these pieces together to then do the work.
Yeah.
And then sometimes you get messy stuff and sometimes you get really clear stuff. So there's the whole process of like making sense of what you've just produced. If it's super clear, you're lucky. It's rarely that clear. And there's an iterative process of kind of figuring out what you have figured out and what you still need to figure out until, and then it ends with like our public performance of like publishing the paper to the world that presents, what we found.
Yeah.
And that's like more of a creative description. There's a whole theory about how you properly do the scientific process to rigorously present hypotheses and test them and all that kind of stuff. But
do you have an overwhelming fear of being wrong? I mean, is that why? Has anybody ever published a paper and then it's just wrong? And it's just
absolutely.
Yeah.
There's
really?
very famous retractions of people who have like falsified data. That's the worst case. Or they'd like publish something that's just wrong.
So is all of the review process and the testing process, is that just part of your being because you just don't want to be wrong? Or have you just been taught that this is the way it goes and you have to do this?
Well, we're based on the idea of peer review, so that like it's hard. Some things get so hyper specialized that even a well-trained PhD scientist wouldn't be able to accurately assess whether it was done well and is interesting and stuff. You really need your peers, your experts to evaluate it. But we're all human and we're fallible, so sometimes that process doesn't work for whatever reason, or sometimes you just get it wrong. Right? You did the wrong analysis or the wrong tests or something like that. I think we're all individuals in science too, so people approach failure in many, many different ways. Some people are motivated by it and like charge on. Other people, it's really hard. And I guess I don't know what it's like in your profession, but it's like absolutely a fundamental part of our profession. Failure. Like you write a grant proposal and the funding rate is abysmal, so you fail more than you succeed. You submit papers for publication and you get like these academic conehead critics who are like trying to find every problem they can, because that's what we're trained to do in this peer review process. So you get rejection notices from your paper and then you have to try again and again. And so I think in order to succeed ultimately in science, you have to be comfortable to some degree with failure. I think if you have really good coping mechanisms or thrive in it, then it's a pretty good adaptation to the profession. I don't know, maybe am I overstating all this?
Well, music is subjective, right? I mean, I could write a piece and half the room might think it's really cool and the other half of the room might think it's the worst thing ever. So I think with us, our failure is just our personal reaction to whether we thought we did our best or not. So I try to avoid failure by just doing the best work I can, but I don't enjoy failure, but I certainly learn from it so that I keep hopefully growing in my craft.
Right. I think that's the adaptation side. Like if you can learn from your failures, you see what people didn't like about your work, and then next round you do better. Like that's in theory how we work. And also, I mean, this science is all about building on what's come before you. And so like people had some crazy ideas back then that got published, and we've learned a lot since then, and we revise it. So like the process of not just refining our understanding, but renewing or even revising our understanding of what we used to know is a key part of how science works.
Sure. Yeah.
And then there's the like ridiculous ones of like coffee's good for you, coffee's not good for you, coffee's good for you, coffee's not good for you, back and forth studies, exactly. Right? Like that's a different kind of...
Depending on who needs to sell more coffee.
Well, right, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, so given this brief discussion and some of the conversations you've had, like what do you, like if you were to give us advice about a creative process from your own experience, not knowing a whole lot about what we do, but like, what would you say you've learned in your career of a musician, arranger, composer, now conductor, like that we're both doing creative acts, but in very different ways.
Yeah.
You think there's something you've learned that might be like good advice for us?
I don't know if it translates. Maybe you can tell me, but in my field, the hardest road for me is to just learn to trust my own voice in the music that I create, because especially when you're younger, you so badly want to be noticed or succeed or something. You might be trying to do something that you heard somebody else succeed at, so you're like, well, if I just kind of hint at that music, because mine isn't good enough yet, I haven't, then maybe I'll succeed too. And then, but everybody senses that right away. If your music is at all false, even if they're not a musician in the audience, they pick up on it. There's something about it. So I've been composing now for 25 years roughly, and it's a very long process to be trusting in my own voice. But I just had a premiere about a month ago, and a musician that I trust. I trust them all, but he was in a high position. Let's put it that way. And he just said, what I love about your music is you really just speak from the heart, and that's what appeals to us. And that was so important for me to hear, because I'm not an academically trained composer. I was a trumpet player, right? And so I've always had this kind of imposter syndrome feeling about myself, that I never officially studied being a composer. So what am I doing? Who do I think I am in this field? Yes, I'm making a living at it, but it just doesn't seem right. So that's always been like looking over my own shoulder. So the fact that he said to me that, I just really appreciate that you trust that your music comes from the heart, that has given me a lot of confidence to move forward and continue to create music that way. So I was happy he said that.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that applies at all in your
I think
field.
It does.
Yeah?
Yeah.
And I think when you get to a certain level, as all of you have, you're just searching for these things that keep inspiring us to reach new heights. And sometimes you don't get it, and you do your job, and you move on, and you keep looking for the next thing. But that's kind of what I'm after anyway. So.
That's a good note to end on. So that's all. Thanks.
Good note. Another pun.
I'm
don't
full
get
of
me
them.
started.
I started and ended on it, so
Yes,
I
you
bookended
did.
the conversation. So anyway, thanks so much, Jim, for the time.
You're welcome.